Hello and welcome to FTD Talk. My name is John James and I am a writer and campaigner for male victims of female perpetrated domestic violence. Today we talk to yet another male victim of abuse. We talk to Jeffrey Ketland about his abuser, the things that he went through, and the psychological state of his abuser. This is his story. Okay, welcome Jeffrey to FTD Talk. Thank you for talking to me today.
Okay.
Nice. I want to start by asking you how you and your abuser met.
We met. We met when I was a lecturer and she was a student at university, and she sent me an email asking me to look at something that she'd written. I wasn't her lecturer, but she sent me an email asking me to look at something that she'd written, and that's how we met. So we didn't meet socially; we met at university.
And how did you get together?
Well, that took years. In fact, it's an incredibly long story. So story goes over, well, I guess 12 years now, going back to 2008. But it begins with this person having a kind of crisis and me not understanding it very well. And this crisis went on for a couple of months. And she dropped out of university. And she made some suicide attempts as well. And she had begun contacting me a great deal during that time. In fact, after a while, it became relentless. And it's one occasion in which I prevented her. She took an overdose, and I prevented her. I located her and took her to hospital. Anyway, it's a long story, but that gradually settled down after a couple of months. That was the end of 2008, and we became friends. I was not teaching her or anything, but we became quite good friends for the next 2 years. So we saw each other, just around all the time. She would sometimes come and visit me, and sometimes we'd socialize and stuff. So we knew each other quite well for about 2 years. That doesn't say how we eventually some sort of relationship began. That occurred about 2 years later, the end of 2010, and that happened. It's a long story. She'd been intimating to me for a long time that she was quite romantically interested in me, and my wife and I were splitting up. We'd been on the verge of splitting up for a couple of years by then, and in fact, on one occasion, she'd actually come round to my house and our house and shouted at my wife, and then left, and then called me, and I asked her to tell me where she was, and she wouldn't. And I eventually reported her to the police, and the police, in fact, detained her. And I actually broke up contact with her for the next months. So it's quite a long gap. But then eventually I broke up with my wife, and I went to live with a friend. And when I was living with my friend, his name is Matthew, in Edinburgh, this is the end of 2010 now, this person contacted me, and she essentially invited herself over to where I was living, and that's how things began.
What do you think drew her to you?
Drew her to me? So probably the fact that we'd become very good friends, and nobody really paid much attention to her when she had this period a couple of years earlier when she was going through this crisis. And I think that's what she thought about me was that I was some kind of person who would protect her or something like that. maybe some other things as well. I mean, she obviously thought that I was a university lecturer and stuff, so she obviously thought that I was, smart and things of that nature as well. So um, probably those are the two main things. And number one, that we were pretty close, and I wasn't this, she'd sometimes complain about people being a bit creepy around her, and.
Okay.
I was not anything like that. I'm not remotely interested in those things. And the other thing was, I guess she just admired me for the kind of academic work that I do.
And why were you drawn to her after she'd shouted at your wife?
Oh, that's a very long story. I mean, I'm sorry, that's my phone making a noise. We'd we'd been friends for a long, long time at that point, and there was that blowout, and I don't think I wasn't particularly. It's very hard to say how to recreate in my mind how I felt back then, which was I think 2010, when I was gradually splitting up, breaking up from my wife, and she was showing a fair amount of romantic interest in me, and I didn't really know how I felt about it, so I had very mixed feelings about it. When she did have this thing with my wife, I forgave her. It was like when I look back, it was like a red flag, but I forgave her. I mean, because I liked her a lot. We got on very, very well. We had a fair amount in common.
Mm-hmm.
We had a lot in common. We're both from Birmingham, for example. There's lots and lots of other things that we had in common. So I don't know. There was a variety of things, really, and for some reason I forgave her. It took several months, in fact, and I had to think about it. But maybe I was stupid to do so, but I did. I did. It was about 5 months that gap.
And when did you think that things weren't quite right?
Well, this relationship only lasted for a short period, only for a couple of weeks.
Oh, right.
Yes. So this relationship only lasted for about 3 weeks. And when it ended, she then went on to stalk me for another 2.5 years. So she turned into, if you've seen the film Fatal Attraction, then
Yeah.
most of that I experienced,
Could
including,
you explain some of the experiences that you went through?
well, there's the 3 weeks that we had this short relationship, which was a short romantic relationship. It was very unpleasant, in fact. And so she could be extremely abusive. She began monitoring my phone. She'd be abusive when she stayed over. She kicked over a table once, glass broke, and I remember a shard of glass got stuck in my toe. She started arguments. She demanded that I delete stuff from my phone. I remember I just separated from my wife, and she demanded that any connections with my wife be deleted and removed. She was intensely paranoid about people that I spoke to. And then at the end of those 3 weeks, she assaulted me. There were various other incidences that happened as well, which were just really extreme forms of behavior. Just sudden outbursts, incredibly sudden outbursts that just didn't make any sense at all. There was one where we were on the sofa and I was reading a newspaper. I think it was the Mirror, and it had a picture of Simon Cowell on the front. And I think he was a Peppermint Rhino, right? You know that sort of place? So I think he's a Peppermint Rhino. And I'm reading this, and I'm not actually reading the front page. And she sees it, and she suddenly announces, and she was very funny as well, actually, person, and she suddenly announces, Simon Cowell is gay. And I went, Oh, okay, no, I don't know. I don't think so. She, no, he is, and this is all a big front. I went, yeah, okay, yeah, right. Simon Cowell is gay. You said so. And she suddenly got very upset, and she started repeating it, and I kept joking about it. And then she said, but getting increasingly upset. Uh, some of my friends are gay as well. And I said, yeah, but Simon Cowell's not one of your friends. And eventually
Yeah.
she got up. This all happened sitting on the sofa. There's nothing, dramatic, at least for me. I'm just sitting there with the Daily Mirror in my hands. She got up and went to the downstairs loo and locked herself inside the downstairs loo. And I
Mm.
didn't. It's just here that she'd gone up and locked herself in the downstairs loo. I thought that's extremely weird. Uh,
Very
and I
strange.
and I got up and I went to the downstairs loo. Her name was Charlotte, and I said, what are you doing?" She said, "I'm just in the toilet," and she'd locked the door. Okay, and she remained there for the next half an hour. It's weird, and then she came out about half an hour later and said, "Look, I'm really sorry. I got so upset. Um, can you show me where the Hoover is?" And okay, and this is the truth. Honestly, I promise you this happened. And I said, "Yeah, well, it's in the cupboard in the kitchen." And she said, I like to Hoover when I get really upset."
Yeah.
So she got the Hoover
Okay.
and started hoovering the hallway, calmed down from being so upset. That was one of the events that happened. So there's a whole series of events that were wild and strange and extreme. And there were two events in which she assaulted me, pinned me down, uh, and forced me to have sex with them. And the first, she succeeded. I was kind of tired and worn out, and she got away with it. And on the second, which was 4 days later, she pinned me down and tried to start things off. And I eventually pushed her off. It took two episodes of this, spaced by about 10 minutes. And eventually I pushed her off. And then she began shouting at me, calling me, "You effing this, you effing that, you effing asshole." And she's getting really furious. And I went and hid in the kitchen. And this is my friend's flat. His name's Matthew in Edinburgh. So I was saying, "I tell you what, Charlotte, you need to go home. Okay, just go home," because she could go home. It was nearby. She could get back in about 6 or 7 minutes. And so she's shouting at me, and I'm telling her to go home. And then before I know it, there's a knock on the door, and the police come in. So the police come in, and my flatmate comes in, and the police were then there for about an hour asking us about what had happened. And I'm playing it down. I didn't want to say what really had happened. I did say, well, she was kind of on top of me and she started getting angry and upset. And that's really most of what I said. And eventually the police left and they questioned her and me and my flatmate. And they left me with this little note, victim's support on the back. And then after the police left, I eventually told her to leave, and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
That was the end of the 3 weeks, and I broke off contact with her.
Why did you play it down? Was it because you didn't want to get her in trouble, or because you didn't think you'd be believed?
At the time, as I tell you more and more about what happened, you'll understand the thing that you just said about not being believed. That never occurred to me.
Mm-hmm.
That all that stuff which anybody who's gone through this stuff begins to read about, which is true. You just don't realize that the police are just not going to believe you.
Yeah.
You don't realize that aspect of things. You just, unless you've been inside this whole this rabbit hole, you just don't understand. It doesn't make any sense. Why would they not believe me? So that wasn't the reason. Although when they did leave, they tried to persuade her to go home. And when they left, the female police officer, who'd been very nice to me, by the way, and she'd asked me if I wanted to press charges, and I said no. She said, "Well, we've told her to leave and she doesn't want to, but if we have to come back tonight, then we will have to arrest you." And I'd
Oh,
not really thought about that for years later until when events happened a couple of years later, which I'll tell you about. uh, I thought back, well, that's interesting. She did actually, that police officer actually did say that to me. So maybe that was their policy. But the reason I didn't want to take it any further forward is that I didn't want her to get into trouble.
yeah.
I didn't want to escalate. I didn't want to cause trouble. I knew that at the time I was beginning to form an idea that she had a personality disorder. And I was beginning to put these things together. And so I began to worry as well about what she would do to herself if she were put through this kind of process.
Yeah, because you've got a history of that with her anyway, haven't you? Of her attempting suicide. So
Yeah, that's right. But I thought this is just a short-term thing. This is a couple of years earlier. This is just a crisis, where some bad things have happened. She said she had a bad relationship when she was on holiday a few months earlier. She seemed to explain that as being the reason why she'd had this crisis. But now, 2 years later, I'm thinking, okay, no, this is much deeper than that. There's something here. And shortly after that, I spoke to a couple of friends of mine, medics. One's a GP and the other's a psychiatrist, and explained to them that these are the things that she did. She gets irate, furious. She tells me she loves me on the same day, but she tells me she hates me,
yeah.
and she comes out with suicide threats, and she explodes with tantrums, and she wants to control everything. And they said the same thing. It's borderline personality disorder. It's just classic. And subsequently, everyone I've told even a tiny bit about this story with any medical experience has just said the same thing. So the reason I didn't want to push it any further on the police front was because I didn't want to escalate. Didn't know what would happen.
So when she eventually did leave, did you tell her that it was over, it was finished?
Yeah, yeah. I said that's it. Goodbye. Go home. And that's finished.
Did she
And
seem to accept that?
no, she didn't accept it. And she contacted me the next day and said sorry for what she'd done. And then this is December of 2010.
Mm.
And over the next month, she contacted me constantly, relentlessly, begging me to see her. And my flatmate reported that he'd seen her hanging around outside the flat as well. And she was demanding that I see her, speak to her. And on 2 occasions I did, but I carefully arranged to meet my flatmate so I could get away at 6 p.m. or something. So on that occasion when I did actually say, look, I'm going to meet Matthew at 6, I've got to go, because she wouldn't let me go. That was another thing about her behavior, was that you'd be trapped with her for hours and hours and then 8 or 9 hours. And I walked back to the flat and she said, can I come with you? And just essentially followed me back to the flat where I lived. And then a couple of weeks later, I became ill with an infection. My son had had some injections, some vaccinations, and I picked up a really bad infection. I was in bed for about and I was almost immobilized. I was so ill. I just occasionally got out of bed and had some water, and that was it. And I was on my own as well in the house, and there was nobody to speak to and nobody around, nobody to help. And she began sending me text messages and making telephone calls, and those text messages became more and more extreme, and they contained threats and accusations, calling me a cruel, harmless bastard, and suicide threats. And eventually there was a couple of suicide threats. This is now into January of 2011. And I was too ill to deal with it. I couldn't even really pick up the phone and have a conversation. So I was able to through Jedi mind tricks, get information from the university about where her friend, what her telephone number was. The details are complex. I just knew her friend's first name,
Yeah.
but I could work out from the university system, and I had an idea about the subject she was studying as well. And I could work out from the university system who she was and what her telephone number was. And I got the telephone number and contacted her friend and said, look, Charlotte's gone bananas. She's threatening me, stalking me, harassing me. Just how to leave me alone. Okay, and please deal with it. And then that was it. Her friend sent me a snarky message back saying, you should speak to her. And I replied, no way am I going to speak to her. This is crazy. And then, so that was it. And that was from then on, I had almost no contact from my part with her for the next 2.5 years. But she then began stalking me, which then went on for another 2.5 years in total. And then at the end of that, to cut this long story short into just a half, she committed suicide.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
so she carried out the threat that she'd had for a long time.
Yeah, she did. So it's that intervening 2.5 years is a pretty long gap as well. And she'd been sending me Facebook messages, text messages. I'm just ignoring everything. I went away from Edinburgh to work in another country. I came back a few months later for a few days, and I arranged on Facebook to meet with a couple of friends in a pub. And when I turned up in the pub with my friends, guess who's sitting in the corner? And so I ignored her. She's sitting there in the corner. She then leaves, and then I then get a flurry of text messages. So she's stalking me at a pub when I'm speaking to my friends. And she carries on sending me emails and love letters, and sometimes the sort of expressions of love and permanent love, and I'll always love you. And I thought about us getting married and so on. And sometimes they're just abusive. And I didn't really reply to them. There was one of them in the summer of that year when she finally got her degree. And she got a really good degree, and I congratulated her. And then she emailed me back later and said, can we please speak on the phone? And I said, no, thank you. I don't want to speak on the phone. And then she sent an incredibly abusive reply to that, saying, well, I've got a wonderful boyfriend now who I trust. And so I just ignored that. Anyway, so it's a long story that goes on for the next 2.5 years. And eventually, I said that and we actually at the end of the year, I reneged on not speaking to her or having any contact with her, because she sent me a long email in August of that year. It's kind of long, kind of semi-closure email saying, look, it's clear that you don't have any more contact with me. It's a long email talking about stuff. And I eventually reneged on my decision not to speak to her, and I replied to it. And then she called me. We spoke on Skype a couple of times at the end of 2011. And then we spoke on Skype again a few months later when she revealed to me that she was following me to my new job. And that was really scary. And I became ill as a result of that. I developed stress-related prostatitis. And I needed medical treatment for the next few months. And eventually I had a biopsy and all kinds of things. And cystoscopy investigation stuff. And eventually they said, you have prostatitis and it may be stress induced. Do you have, much stress? And I said, yeah, I have quite a lot of stress. I've got a stalker. And she said, I didn't tell them what had happened. She just revealed to me that I just got a job at Oxford. And she's just revealed to me that she is now following me to Oxford as well. Because I mentioned that we'd spoken on Skype several months earlier. I made the mistake of telling her that I was just applying for
Yeah.
a job because I had a couple of friends there, and I had a good chance of getting a job. And then the following year, January of 2012, she applied and got in. And when she revealed that to me, I became ill. And anyway, to kind of long story short, we moved. I reconciled with my wife eventually in that year, and we moved to Oxford. And she then moved to Oxford. In Oxford, when she was there, she began stalking my wife again. She was obsessed with my wife. My wife would go to town from the house where we lived. I don't know if you know Oxford at all, because you're in Worcester, right?
Yeah.
So we lived we lived not that far from the town centre, and you could walk into town. And my wife would see Charlotte just hanging around nearby, frequently once a week or something. And at the end of about 5, and it's deliberate. It's definitely deliberate. I know that people often say that these things are accidental, but I know it was deliberate. And eventually, my wife left, and then there were a couple of other stalking incidents before, with her towards me in the intervening time. But then after my wife left, my wife just had enough. And during that time, my wife had been saying to me, "Look, you just need to report her to the police. Report her to the police. She's a crazy one." And I, same thing that I might come back to this in a bit, because after she committed suicide, colleagues of mine at work, and after the witch hunt I was then subjected to, colleagues of mine said, "Jesus, you should have reported her to the police. Then a lot of this stuff wouldn't have happened." And my response to that was, if I report her to the police, she will just distract immediately. Anyway, so she began contacting me again at my college where I worked, and I organised like a philosophy club for my students, and she turned up to that club and sat right next to me, pretending not to know me, and it just freaked me out. So it was just terrifying. And she'd done something similar the day before, and it's just obvious stalking. And other people around, of course, don't know that you're being stalked by this person that you've known for 5 years. And on that second occasion, when I came out of the seminar that I'd just been, I organised it, and she was sitting there right next to me, pretending not to know me. I came out because I was just terrified, and I just wanted to go home. And the other student that she was with called out to me. He said, "Jeff, this is my friend Charlotte. She's from Birmingham, like you." And I'm going, right, okay, and I don't speak. I just kind of walk off. Like, yeah, I know who she is, right? She's my stalker. I mean, she's pretending not to know me, but and he didn't know, of course. And this is at my college, nothing to do with her. In Oxford, everything's broken up into colleges, and she was at a different college, so she'd come to my college. So I told her to leave me alone by email later that evening, and then things escalated and escalated for the next month. Turned out she'd been interacting with militant feminists on her course, and they began to escalate massively. I told her to leave me alone. They wrote a letter attacking me. She didn't write the letter. They wrote the letter attacking me. This is what happens when you interact with militant feminists. And so they wrote this letter, which had some input obviously came from Charlotte, and the other stuff came from the paranoid militant feminists. And I sent a reply by email to the letter saying, "This is just defamatory. And plus, you assaulted me. Leave me alone." And 2 days later, I was visited by the police. And the police gave me a harassment warning.
Gave you an harassment warning.
Gave me a harassment warning. Gave me a harassment warning.
Jesus.
And they didn't actually have the whole thing was very strange. They didn't have a statement from her. She didn't give a statement. And they didn't have a printed letter or anything like that. And the police officer that came to see me just said, well, I've been told to do this. And I said, I'm completely innocent. I mean, she was stalking me. And I told her to stop up and leave me alone. And I showed him the evidence. And he said, well, there's nothing I can do about this, because, this has just been given to you. And if it's given to you, it's given to you. That's that. So he said, will you sign my notebook? And I signed his notebook. That was it. And I said, but I protest this very strongly. So I've now been given this damn harassment warning, telling my stalker to shut off. So at this point, I'd told many of my colleagues what my problem is, and I told a couple of them earlier that I had a woman. There's a woman who's my stalker, and she's here, and she's been following me around for years, and it's a long story, and I don't want to get into the details. And gradually, I told more and more of my colleagues about what was happening. This was in May of 2013. Mm-hmm. Plus, I'm extremely worried about her behavior. I mean, she's been suicidal, seriously suicidal in the past. And then a couple of days after the harassment warning, I got an email from the female police officer who had dealt with, Charlotte Pussy had dealt with, telling me now that she sort of wanted to withdraw her accusation of me harassing her, because she didn't want me to tell anybody what had happened. And I always kind of went ballistic with this police officer on the phone, saying, this is just preposterous. It's ridiculous. You've just given me this warning. I'm the victim here. Plus, she's extremely unstable. And anyway, that evening I sent her a long email. Still have the email I sent to the police officer. It's very clear this Charlotte is very unstable. She's done crazy things to herself in the past. She's abused me, threatened me, and stalked me. I've done nothing wrong. I just told her to leave me alone. Anyway, the police officer then told me, okay, well, if she contacts you again, then please contact us. And I said, okay, fine. And she noted that down apparently in her records. I have a copy of the records to go through this later. And a couple of weeks later, she did contact me again. She stalked me again. That's where I worked. It'd take a while to explain what happened, but I went to work, went upstairs to the landing. There were no students around. I saw a colleague of mine. And then she came out of a room right next to us and stood staring at me, and then walked down the stairs staring at me. And she'd clearly been waiting for me, because this was a regular event that I went to every Monday, I think, at 4 o'clock. She was stalking me again, but this time she was looking incredibly depressed and bedraggled. And a couple of days later, I emailed the police and said, look, can I speak to you again? Because I wanted to report what had happened. And the police officer emailed me back and said, well, I'm off work at the moment till next week. So can you email me next week? And I emailed him and said, okay, I'll get back to you next week on the 12th of June. And then on the 10th of June, 2013, her boyfriend split up with her, and she committed suicide about an hour or two later.
And how did that make you feel?
Well, that was the end of the first half of all this long story, and I was just gutted. I was absolutely just completely gutted. I'd notified people. I'd notified my academic director. I'd notified the chaplain at the college where I worked. I was getting more and more concerned about it. I'd notified the police, 2 police officers now. I'd said, she might be a serious danger to herself. I'm not joking. I'm serious. And I'd said the same thing to my academic director. I'm scared of her, but I'm scared of what she might do to herself. And I've told several other people at this point, maybe 6 or 7. A friend of mine had actually independently contacted her academic department as well and told them that she was a danger to herself and might need professional help if she would behave strangely. They actually ignored it, but that's that all turns out to be important later. But I just felt gutted, absolutely gutted. It was just awful, absolutely sickening. And I knew so little about the circumstances. They were not really revealed to me for another 7 or 8 months, and it's just horrible. It's just horrible.
So what happens then?
What happens after that?
Yeah.
Well, what happens after that is that you remember, I'd said that, or two important things. Number one, it turns out later that she'd had a very turbulent relationship with her boyfriend and that she'd had an abortion. And I happen to know that she was pretty strongly anti-abortion as well. And she thought that, this turned out, I didn't know this at the time or any of this, I only found out a year later, but she felt that she'd murdered her child. So part of her nervous breakdown was that she felt that she'd murdered her child. And that contributed to it. The other two things were, the first was that I'd notified various people, and faculty had been notified that she was a risk. She was a serious risk to herself. So that means that they had a duty of care, which they had actually ignored, leading to a student's death. And the other thing was that her housemate was one of the feminist activists who wrote this letter. And it later turned out that the housemate was the activist who persuaded her to contact the police and give me this warning. And the housemate is also the same person that found her body as well. It's very strange because she committed suicide in the house where her housemate actually was. It's not like she went to see her husband and say, I'm really upset about everything that's happened. She just came home somehow, and the housemate's in the same house, and went to her bedroom and committed suicide. So it's a very strange event. Her housemate must have been only a few meters away from her when this happened. So her housemate, who's an American feminist activist, began calling me a murderer.
Oh, wow, you got the blame for that as well.
Yeah, oh yes. I got the mega blame for that. So her housemate began calling me a murderer to everyone that she spoke to. And a funeral occurred about a week later, and several people who went to the funeral reported back to me, because Charlotte and I had intersecting friends and stuff, and common friends, and they reported back to me, this crazy American woman at the funeral, and she is upsetting everybody by calling you a murderer. And she then erected a mob, including, not her name's Brooke Benson. She erected a mob of activists, like an outrage mob, like cancel culture, and stuff. An outrage culture, calling me a murderer. The department has a murderer. This man has murdered my housemate. He's bullied her to death. And she began distributing this on social media, on Twitter. I have records of this. She began telling everybody, and she just raised a mob of activists. The student union got involved. They were activists, other activists, academic activists, who just academic philosophy professors. They got involved as well. All of a sudden, there's like a big campaign to have me thrown out, and on social media and in blogs, and it's so that's the first wave of what began to happen. And then as that happened, the faculty head essentially threw me to the mob instead of telling the mob to go screw themselves, which is what he should have done. He basically just said, he's not a witness to anything, and there aren't any witnesses, and they can't really put me through any complicated disciplinary process because there's nobody for me to interrogate because she's gone. And the whole thing is just ridiculous. I mean, and the people who had been witnesses, like my academic director and the chaplain and other academics, were all saying, this is ridiculous. He hasn't done anything. What are you going to accuse him of? And the academic director made up a ridiculous, it's not the academic director, my faculty head, made up a story and had me thrown out of my job. And at the same time, the activists pressurized the Oxfordshire coroner to read out two statements, one written by the boyfriend and the other written by the housemaids. And they're just completely full of fabrications. The whole thing was just completely fabricated. And this was read out in court, and then it was published in national newspapers. And you can Google them if you like, and you can see the stories that were written about me. They're completely fabricated. There's no truth in any of these stories, apart from the tiny fact that we did have a relationship about 4 years earlier, or 5 years earlier, depending on the timescale here. And everything else is just false accusations. So the short version of that is they raised a vigilante mob and drove me out.
Is the official story then that you caused her death?
No, that is by no means.
As told by them.
The official story as told by them is precisely that.
Yeah.
They're militant feminists. Women are helpless creatures. And she was a student. I'm the evil, wicked, powerful, professor, lecturer. I must have caused it by the terrible things that I did, although they don't have any evidence for any of those things. So for them, for the activists, that is the story that...
Did you have no say in court?
I was not told about it, so I didn't informed. So the assistant coroner just read these things out without informing me. I didn't know about it. In fact, I contacted the coroner's office about 4 or 5 months earlier to say, do you want me to give you a statement? What are you going to say? And they said, you're not relevant. And then and then through my lawyer, I got a lawyer. I contacted them again, maybe 4 or 5 times over the next 4 months. You're not relevant. We don't want a statement from you. You're not relevant. We're not going to mention you. And then all of a sudden, bang, I mention. And, he is engaged in a campaign of harassment. And he abused this woman and he followed her to Oxford. And you can read these stories if you like. They're in the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and the Times. And the stories are crazy. They just make it look like I'm some kind of evil murderer. But I was not. She was actually a domestic abuser. She has sexually assaulted me. She threatened me. She harassed me. I have all the records. She was arrested for harassing my wife. She stalked my wife, stalked me at my workplace. I mean, these are all documented. But the story that was published was almost the exact inverse of the truth. And that's why this story is not just about domestic violence or domestic violence by a woman against a man. It's got all the other elements of the certain aspects of the behavior of the police. The police will punish you if you're a bloke, and even though you're a victim, and the behavior of the activists, the assumptions that they make, you're just presumed guilty.
What kind of impact did all this have on your life? Especially with it being out there in the media.
It's just catastrophic. I mean, when you're falsely accused, it's a little bit like Johnny Depp. So in a way, I was kind of Johnny Depp. And I don't know how much negative impact, cancellation, as it's now called, he has suffered since Amber Heard made her public accusations against him. But people drop you. You're just dropped. They just disappear. They unfriend you from Facebook, and almost everybody abandons you. It's really shocking. And at the time that this stuff was read out in the coroner's court, I was simultaneously fired, essentially by the faculty head, for my job. So I was now actually terminated from my job, as well as having been publicly vilified with complete fabrications. But there was a footnote in my termination letter, which said you have the right to appeal. And I spoke to a few people about this, and they all said, "Don't bother. There's no way. No way you can win." The union, basically, who I'd spoken to, were extremely skeptical, and other people were skeptical. But one friend of mine said, "You've got nothing to lose. And, just kick them in the teeth as hard as you can, and appeal." And so I appealed about 5 months, and the senior coroner helped me. I wrote to him several times and said, "Look, you can guess what I said." I said, "Mr. Salter, this story is bollocks." These things do. Here's the evidence. Here's all our emails, the text messages. This is the witness statement. This is my wife saying, she was arrested and stuff. This story is bollocks. And he composed a rather nice apology letter, which I was able to use in my appeal. And I went through this complicated, it's a very secret appeal at Oxford University, by the way. And I won, and I had to be reinstated. It was presided over by a judge, famous judge, in fact. And he granted said, "You have to be reinstated." So I was reinstated. But this is not the end of the story. But anyway, he reinstated me, so I won. And that really pissed off the activists.
I bet.
So I'm now reinstated to my job. That was August of 2014. But that was just a mammoth effort. It was hundreds and hundreds of pages long. There's so many things that I had to do. And over that period of 4 or 5 months in writing and preparing that detailed appeal, and I had to prepare all these arguments, try and throw every conceivable argument I could at the university to try and defend myself. And I had no lawyer as well. I'm completely without a lawyer. I'm just defending myself on my own. And but anyway, at the end of that, I was reinstated to my job. But at that point, I was now homeless because I'd had to give up. When I was fired, at roughly the same time, my contract was coming to an end with my landlord. So they said, "Can you renew your contract for a year?" And I said, "I can't renew my contract for a year." So I had to give up my home, and I was basically homeless for the next 8 months. I just slept in my office, and I'm abandoned by lots and lots of colleagues. My family don't help me at all. And no, it's terrible, absolutely terrible.
So, how did your life get back on track?
Well, the truth is, it didn't. It just didn't. If you've, there are several aspects here of getting back on track, and it may get back on track in the next month or two. It's partly got back on track, but it's very unstable over the last year. But it may get more seriously back on track in the next month or two. But I was reinstated, but a year and a half later, I was forced out. I was forced to resign. And I think they just wanted revenge against me. I'd been publicly vilified and demonized. So they forced me out of my job, and I was left unemployed. I was now unemployed for the next 3 years, till the start of January 2019. So, things got even worse. In fact, I had a heart attack as well in 2017.
Wow.
And I was unemployed for about 2.5 years. No income, just horrific. And I'm trying to get jobs, and I have no success getting jobs. I'm blacklisted academically, which means that I can't get a job, an academic job of the kind that I normally do in the UK or abroad. So I'm just completely screwed. and that's that. I mean, that doesn't even go near, having a job and then maybe thinking maybe I can go and get some psychotherapy help or something for having been, abused and stalked and driven out of my job by vigilantes. We were actually driven out of our home because the housemate was sending me messages calling me a murderer, which was terrifying my wife. And I reported that to the police. We were actually driven out of our home at the time by the vigilantes. And then a year and a half later, after I was reinstated, I was forced to resign. And that story itself is a kind of crazy story as well. The person who drove that was an envious, jealous, temporary lecturer. And he told lies about me and got me forced out of my job. And that was in 2016. But in March of this year, a friend of mine contacted me on Facebook and said, look at this story, Karma. And the person who got me driven out of my job was convicted for child porn and imprisoned.
No.
So I don't know, people look at this, I tell people these things and they just don't believe that these things can have happened, but it really did happen. So the person who got me in the end forced me, it was his crazy claims about me that was used as a pretext to force me out of my job in 2016. It's really just powerful people, co-workers who wanted to get rid of me because of the reputation damage issue. He really was into child porn, and he has a conviction. He got convicted for it, and he got sent to prison. So I got met friends of mine did actually contact people I'd not heard from for 5 years. Messages from Facebook, Karma, read this. Peter King has just been in prison. That's incredible karma. On Twitter, I just wrote, well, there is a God after all. Anyway, a year ago, just over a year and a half ago, a colleague of mine in Poland, we'd been speaking to each other a little bit by email, said, maybe you can try and get a job here. I can help. And he helped me get a job in Poland. It's only a temporary job for 2 years. So he helped me get a research job at the University of Warsaw. So I've been at the University of Warsaw since February last year. So things very, very slowly improving. But the total amount of damage is huge. I mean, it's almost as if I can't even really sit down and think about having a nice chat with a psychotherapist once a week. It's like the damage is just so big. You lose all your friends, you lose all your family, you lose all your colleagues, people who used to contact you all the time. You used to get 50 emails a day. Now you don't even get 5 emails a week. And it's just devastating. It's terrible. All of this.
This is, I think, one thing that people don't understand. When the abuse is over, like your abuser committed suicide, my abuser left, people think that's it. That's the end of it.
Yeah.
People don't understand the aftermath, the trail of destruction that's left behind by abuse.
Yes. Well, one aspect of this was, and I had to look this up, and I gradually began to research BPD, was hypervigilance. I was left with intense hypervigilance when I didn't want to go out after this period I described at the end of the relationship where she's gone crazy and she's sending me these messages and threats and stuff. I didn't socialize with people, and I'm frightened of people. And that's called hypervigilance. And then with the stalking continues, I saw a therapist for a couple of times, about 4 or 5 times. Nice lady, her name's Angela, in Oxford. And she did these tests on me, and she just said, well, if you'd been at war, this would just be PTSD. These anxiety tests and sleep tests, and these tests to do with what you think about and stuff. So effectively, I have PTSD, and the aftermath is huge. It doesn't just, as you say, it just doesn't just go click and stop. You know, it continues. And in my case, there's that, and then also the false accusations and the witch hunt on top as well. So it's gigantic.
And how do you feel about talking to me today about it?
I don't mind talking to people about this stuff now. It took me, I mean, imagine the situation back at the end of 2013. This woman, I'd known this woman, we were very close. We were very, very close friends for 2 years. We really enjoyed each other's company. We had similar taste in music, all kinds of things. We were very, very close. And I'd prevented her killing herself. And she often said, well, thank you for that. You know, not for you. And she got a good degree. And then, but she wanted to have a romantic thing with me, and I didn't want to go through with that. I was happy for her to just go on with her life however she chose. And then 2 years later, she's now committed suicide. That's just horrific. But then the university wants to accuse me effectively of murdering her. And the only way I can defend myself is by saying, but she was completely crazy. She was lying about me. I couldn't bring myself to say these things. And briefly, I did have a lawyer, and she kept criticizing me precisely for this reason. She said, you should stop defending her and defend yourself. So that took that was just grief. I couldn't talk about it particularly openly with people. But now I can. I don't feel any difficulty in talking about what happened. About it. And I gave this talk at the International Conference on Men's Issues 2 years ago, which I guess if you have listeners, then they can look that up. And there's an interview with me as well. So I don't feel any I'm not quite sure what the right word, embarrassment or something about talking about any of these things. And I'm not making anything up, or I'm just telling the truth about what happened. So I don't know. How do you feel about talking about things like this? Does it recreate the pain somehow?
The writing of my book that recreated the pain.
Right.
I relived everything when I wrote the book. And then after it was finished, I didn't really care then. All I wanted to do was help other people then.
It was cathartic then.
Very, very cathartic. Yeah, I got everything out of me when I wrote the book, and then everything's just come.
Say the end of. What was the time gap between the end of the relationship and you writing the book? Was it big?
No, not really. It was we ended the relationship about March 2017.
Yeah.
And the book came out August 2018.
Okay, so it's about a year and a half.
Yeah.
With me, I'm put through this secret process in which I have to defend myself against somebody I was incredibly close to, and who I'm grieving over, who's dead. It was just impossible for me it was just really hard for me to participate in that fight, because you're in a no-win situation.
Yeah.
But a couple of years later, it clicked in my mind. The sense of grief is now gone. It took about 2 years for the sense of grief over her death to go away. Actually, I think maybe close to 3, but eventually that intense sense of grief had gone, and that was helped by me actually asking an intermediary where she was buried. And in fact, it turns out she was buried very, very close to where I used to live, where I grew up in Birmingham, where she grew up in Birmingham as well. so I could find it very easily. And I just went and sat there at the grave. And, oh, Jesus Christ, you lunatic! Why did you do this to yourself? You didn't have to kill yourself, for fuck's sake. Sorry, excuse the French, but you didn't have to do that. Anyway, that all released most of it, and then afterwards, I began blogging about. I had a heart attack about a year later, and then I thought, right, that's it. Right, I'm not going to put up with having been demonized and with me not fighting back and putting my side of what happened. So I began blogging about it, and I blogged about it, and I've written, I don't know how many blog posts, quite a few blog posts about what happened, and that's been very cathartic. And the other thing as well is that I blogged about domestic violence, and I've done a lot of research of my own into that topic, and I've blogged about false accusations, and I've done a lot of research into that as well, and I've compiled a database of false accusations, and about 130, and so all of this has been. It's not what I would have what I would have wanted to do with my life. I didn't choose this. I'd like just to do what I'm good at. I'm a car mechanic. I like to fix cars, and I'm an academic, so I'd like to just do my stuff. But at the moment, I'm not able to do that. Well, that might change in the next couple of months. But for that period when I was unemployed and screwed, I did those things, and those things were all helpful, and they were cathartic in getting that out of my system. I don't feel any guilt in relation to this woman's tragic suicide. I'm not in any way responsible for what she did to herself.
No, exactly. You shouldn't feel any guilt at all because, like you say, you're not responsible. So
the thing is that I never felt that I didn't feel that responsibility because I already knew that she had it within herself to do this to herself. I'd been there and experienced it when she'd tried before several years earlier. And I also began to find out more and more about her unstable relationship with her boyfriend, that she was being treated in a psychiatric hospital in Oxford for suicidal behavior, that she'd had an abortion. So, all of this stuff made sense of what she did to herself in the end. And the activists, their behavior, they escalated things so sharply. And it would not surprise me in the slightest if their escalation played a fairly significant role in what she did to herself. Because I think at the end of her life, when she was contacting me again, it wasn't romantic. I think she just wanted me to rescue her again, which I couldn't, to be honest, do. Again, I'm not physically, psychologically, cognitively capable of doing it again. It's just too painful. But I think that she was in a massive hole because her boyfriend was going to dump her, and she's borderline, and she's going to detonate when her boyfriend dumps her. And she just wants me to rescue her. And I just said, go screw yourself, darling, no way. But I had no idea what was happening. And it was the activists around her who escalated and escalated, involved the police, involved the student union, massively turned the volume up. So in the end, she, by the way, couldn't be rescued by me because she couldn't contact me because I've been given a harassment warning, and that goes both ways. And that means that she couldn't, just turn up one day and say, "Oh, please, can you help?" Because my boyfriend's going to dump me, because now she'd be contravening the harassment warning that I'd been ridiculously given because of her marriage. So anyway, it's a long and complicated story with all these different bits and pieces. It's probably a bit different from the things that you normally discuss, because my guess is that normally you just have an abusive relationship, and then it might involve the police or social services or something like that.
I hear all kinds of stories, and I'm really glad that I spoke to you today, because like I said earlier, one of the major aspects for me is the aftermath. And your story just shows how bad the aftermath can be.
Yeah, yeah, it's horrific. It's horrific, and it's public attitudes and institutional attitudes and police attitudes to this stuff. They really have to change. Um, we both know the way that Refuge, for example, and Women's Aid, and certain politicians and certain journalists spin all this stuff, and it's just outrageous. I participated in this guy on Twitter called Phil Mitchell, um, who does counselling and psychotherapy for men who've been, often gay men who've been sexually abused, and young boys who've been sexually abused. His name's Phil Mitchell, and he's connected to, I think, survivors, Manchester survivors. Anyway, a couple of years ago, another person, a police officer on Twitter, had distributed a request from the BBC for participants to a program about sexual violence against men, and I responded to that and was involved briefly in a small part of this program that BBC Three made in 2017. I'm only in it for about 1 minute, but for about 1 minute I describe what happened to me, and it's the aftermath is serious, and there's very little support out there, and very little understanding, and a great deal of prejudice.
And from your story about the response of the police, I find that a common theme.
Yeah.
That the police are just so ignorant, biased, whatever you want to call it. And unfortunately, they don't understand male victims at all.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm really very unsure about whether this just comes from old-fashioned chivalry of some kind, or whether it comes from official training of some kind. But these two things will dovetail together, because old-fashioned chivalry basically says women are victims and men are beasts. That's kind of old, and but except me, and I will protect. I'm a white knight. I will protect the poor damsel in distress. And feminist propaganda, which is very highly disseminated throughout policing and throughout criminal justice system, says the same thing. Women are victims. Believe women. You have to believe women, believe victims. And that automatically means you have to disbelieve men. And that means you're a long, long way behind in the credibility stakes. I don't know what I don't know how to change that.
Hopefully, with brave men such as yourself speaking out, and programs such as this one, and groups such as Mankind Initiative, hopefully, sooner or later, the glass ceiling's going to shatter.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I've thought about this quite a bit, and I'm actually somewhat pessimistic. Sometimes you see there's this kind of low level of events that happen, sometimes conferences that happen, or occasionally there's a film that appears, like The Red Pill appeared a couple of years ago by Cassie J. I actually sat next to Cassie J at the International Conference on Men's Issues in 2018. And then there are a few lawyers who make a point about, sometimes write about these things, sometimes write about false accusations as well. But my overall impression doesn't give me a great deal of confidence. It's like we're a long, long way behind. you just look at funding, for example, to mankind versus funding to the major women's domestic violence service providers, the funding ratio is gigantic. It's like 100 to 1 or something. It's just gigantic.
Yeah.
The number of the resources available to them is 100 times as large. The number of beds and stuff that are available is it's like 100 times, maybe 1,000 times as large. And I don't really see hope that maybe there's going to be some politician. Actually, there is Philip Davis, who sometimes talks about these things in Parliament. But it's not as if there's 20 or 30 MPs regularly disagreeing with Jess Phillips, for example. Jess Phillips is the voice of the Labour Party on these issues, and as we both know, she's against everything we're saying. So it's I don't know. Maybe I'm too pessimistic. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, we can't give up fighting. We got to keep going, keep doing what we're doing, and keep his fingers crossed.
Hello. Yeah. Hello. Sorry, I think the connection got cut off for about 10 seconds or something. So I don't know. It's the aftermath is terrible, and the resources available for people who've been subjected to it are minimal. So it's I don't know. It's some people are more optimistic about serious political change.
Well, hopefully all the stories that are told to me during this show, hopefully people will listen and understand that it is a problem.
Yeah.
And I'd thank you very much for your story today.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate you asking me to come on, and it was nice to have the opportunity.
I appreciate you talking to me. Thanks very much.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot.
You take care now.
And you, okay.
Bye-bye. Hello, and thank you for listening. FTD Talk is a safe and secure environment in which male victims of domestic violence can come on and tell their stories. I hope many more men will come forward and speak on the show and share their experiences. Together, we can defeat this. Take care. I'll see you next week. Peace.
Nothing I could do is ever good enough for you.